Hi, I'm Abby Leal, and I'm going to share a little bit about my senior thesis, Not Exceptions, Historic Views of Women in Art and the Impact on Contemporary Artists. So a little bit of background. I wanted to write this thesis to kind of explore the reasons that so many women have been excluded from art history, which has led to the misconception that the art world has been exclusively male in centuries past, which isn't the case. And I did focus on the Western art world, so it's important to acknowledge that the experiences of women of color have been a lot even more difficult than the experiences that I'll speak about here. Um, and I just wanted to write this because looking back helps us move forward. So I wanted to get a better understanding of how gender dynamics were at play in the past, and just kind of make connections about how some of those things still impact women that are making art today. So starting with the 17th century, there were just a lot of societal boundaries that were on women that discouraged them from pursuing any kind of career, including an art career. Femininity was just relatively unwelcomed in the art world, and women were thought to just be a part of an unequal and lesser sphere than men. This idea was propagated by people like Rousseau, who thought inequality was just inherent and natural, and that women were just naturally less than men. And painters were thought to need qualities like individualism and competitiveness and things that were gendered masculine at the time. And those things were just unnatural for women to possess. They were just thought to be something that women didn't have, and if they did, that made them unfeminine. There were also a lot of educational barriers on women during this time. They were largely barred from academies. The Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture only allowed 15 women in over a 100-year span. And when women were admitted to academies, they were not allowed to attend classes that used nude models. They were thought that the exposure to the male nude would rid women of their delicacy and just make them even less feminine because they had been exposed to something like that. History painting was a dominant genre for much of this period. And because history painting was often of male figures, it required a knowledge of the male form, which many women didn't have because they had been barred from those classes. So that left them at a disadvantage. One woman that did make history paintings during that time was Angelica Kauffman. She had the advantage of working closely with prominent neoclassical painters in Florence, and she was one of 2 women that was admitted to the Royal Academy. So she was one of very few women who painted in the history genre at the time. Impressionism began as a movement towards the end of this time period, and while it was still male dominated, it did see more entrance of women because it didn't require them to have a studio or access to models. They could paint from life, they could paint outside. A lot of them painted scenes of domestic life of like women doing household tasks. One such painter is Mary Cassatt. She painted a lot of women and scenes of families. And she was a well-respected artist, but she too was subjected to sexism during this time. One commentator attributed her ability to paint scenes of mothers and children to her womanhood rather than her talent. So just subtle ways that women were undermined during that time. Education for women did begin to expand at the end of the century. More and more women were admitted to art schools, which was great, but they also faced new challenges in that because they had never experienced like harsh critiques or really arrogant professors. Things like that were kind of a shock and left them at sort of a disadvantage because they had been barred from that world for so long. This time period also allowed for new opportunities for women to exhibit their work, and there was more creation of women-specific spaces. And while these were positive material changes. There were still a lot of institutional barriers that hadn't really changed during this time. So moving into the 20th century, shifting values at the beginning of the century allowed more women to enter the workforce and to pursue careers in the visual arts. The cultural symbol of the new woman kind of represented shifting ideas about womanhood during this time. And a lot of women began to kind of shake off the Victorian ideals of femininity that had persisted in the previous century. Organizations that were created to support women artists continue to flourish despite some male artists pushing back because they were afraid of the feminization of the art world. The modernist movement began during this time, and there was more focus on self-expression, which was good, and they were less bound by past expectations of respectability. However, women were still excluded during this time because there was this shift away from professionalism more towards individualism, just as women were starting to kind of have a leg up in the professional world. They kind of started shifting away from that just as a way to undermine women. There were some improvements in their ability to exhibit work. Really large unjuried shows where everybody's work got in were really great for women because they were guaranteed to have a piece in the show if they submitted one, which was really good exposure. But larger or smaller shows that were juried still mostly excluded women. The Great Depression was a hard time for all artists, but women did experience some security because a lot of them did receive aid during this time. Around 41% of federal aid that went to artists was received by women. And romantic relationships were also really common during this time as a way to kind of get a leg up in the art world. So women would seek out romantic relationships with male artists because they knew that that was a way to get their work out there, and that they also had to kind of weigh the risk against people valuing their work less because they would attribute their success to their partner. Abstract expressionism, which emerged in the 1940s, was a very male-dominated movement still. Lots of emphasis on masculinity, not very well suited to the interests of women. They were almost like actively excluded. It's described as a movement whose mythos was centered on its male heroes, an image of virility that was sent around the world as an ambassador of post-war American power. So it's just a movement that was driven by like power and dynamism and movement and energy and things that were gendered masculine at the time. Some women did make names for themselves in the movement. Lee Krasner is one. She was a fairly successful abstract expressionist, but her career has been very overshadowed by the career of her husband, which was Jackson Pollock. And this kind of relationship dynamic was not uncommon in artist marriages. A lot of women who married other artists, their art was thought to be was often like compared to their spouse's art, or seen as like influenced by their spouse, which kind of undermined their career sometimes and overshadowed it. So the 1960s saw the formation of the women's art movement, which kind of ran parallel to the general women's liberation movement of the time. So they addressed a lot of women's issues like the gender disparity in exhibitions. The Whitney Annual in 1969, only 8 out of 143 artists were women. And that was a big turning point in the movement where a lot of people started to want to address exhibition disparity. And so the Ad Hoc Women's Artists Committee was one of the primary organizations that was part of the Whitney protest. They sent a letter to the museum demanding that half of the artists in the 1970 exhibition be women. Only about 1/5 of the artists in the annual ended up being women, but it was an improvement, and it kind of showed the world and museums that protests were effective, and it gave power to the movement because they had a small success. They also fought for more respect for craft and hobby art, which had been virtually ignored up until that point and just kind of seen as something people did in their personal time. It was viewed as a lesser art, and they sought to have more respect for that kind of art. The 1970s, the movement kind of shifted away from activism and collaboration and focused more on deconstructing femininity and understanding how culture informs how people view gender. One great example of that is Barbara Kruger. She did a lot of work that collaged together images from pop culture with messages printed on them that kind of subverted the meaning or invited people to kind of critique what popular culture was trying to tell us about gender and maybe form some of those ideas for ourselves. The 90s, the art world kind of shifted away from a focus on women and focused more on cultural diversity. So while this new movement didn't so much focus on gender issues, women did still benefit from this movement because they were increasingly accepted into international exhibits, which they hadn't been so much before. At the 1999 Venice Biennale, 1/4 of the artists that exhibited were women, which was a dramatic increase from just 10 years before, where only 1/10 of exhibitors were women. Notable exhibits that were feminist during the time were the Bad Girl exhibits. They allowed women artists that participated to share their own form of feminist art that was maybe outside of the mainstream at the time, which was good and allowed, more personal feminist messages to be shared rather than just what was like the popular narrative at the time. So today, women are obviously much freer to pursue career as artists than they have been in centuries past, which is great. There is still some disparity, though. Women are underrepresented in museums still because work by women is just seen as financially risky to a lot of museum directors. And a 2019 review of artist diversity in 18 major U.S. museums revealed that only 13% of artists on display are women. Those responsible for acquiring work really focus on like name recognition, and a lot of women in the past and today just don't have the same name recognition as men. But there are some museums that are aware of this and working to reduce this gender disparity. The Guggenheim is a great example. Fairly recently, they had an exhibit of a not that well-known painter, Hilma af Klint, that worked during the beginning of the 20th century. And it ended up being a very successful exhibit and kind of served as an example for other museums that sometimes taking a chance on women's work can really pay off. Women still make less than men at auctions, about 40% less on average, and only 5 women account for 40% of all auction sales by women. So there is still a long way to go for auctions as well. So moving forward, how do we continue to make progress and improve the position of women in the art world? The biggest thing is understanding. So knowing that historical hardships do account for any disparity that persists today is really crucial. It can be written off as ancient history or something that doesn't still affect people, because it does. And educating people about women in art history can help provide a more accurate view of why things are the way they are and how they were in the past. So including more women in art history courses is important, and it will end up informing how people interact with work of artists of the past and artists of the present. Having more women in museum leadership is also important. And right now, women and men make up about the same percentage of total museum directors, but larger museums that have larger budgets, the more their budget increases, the likelihood that they have a women director decreases. And while having a woman director does not automatically mean that the museum is going to be working actively to include women in their exhibits and like lessen the effects of like this centuries-long prejudice, it does help to have a woman and have her perspective. That often leads to a greater understanding of women's experience in the art world, which can inform how they direct the museum. And just understanding the root of these prejudices and actively working to change them is how we're going to continue to see these disparities lessen. Yeah, and just educating people is the most important part, because you can't work to change something if you don't know that it's a problem, or you don't know that the centuries of challenges that these women face still affect how they interact with the art world today.